This is Red from This Building Matters, and this is going to be a different kind of video where I do a tier list of Detroit's top 20 tallest skyscrapers. I put out videos on historic buildings every Friday, so please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Let's dive in. So I'm going to start with the First National Building, which is the 20th entry on this list. And if you see me looking up, it's because I have some notes here to make sure I don't get anything too incredibly wrong. But this one was designed by Albert Kahn. It's got 26 stories, and it is 341 feet tall. So this thing is absolutely massive, just a huge building, currently owned by Dan Gilbert, and it houses a bunch of different bedrock businesses. I'm not exactly sure what's all in there, but there's also like Shake Shack and stuff like that in there as well. It's also one of the, I shouldn't say the only, but one of a few buildings where you can really just go inside the lobby and hang out. I've gone in there and used the bathroom before. Just nothing special on the inside, but the public can actually use it, and I think that is worth something, so I'm going to put this one in the A tier. Up next is Hollywood Casino at Greektown, which most people just call Greektown because that's what it was called forever, and it's also in Greektown. Built in 2009 by Paul Steelman and Rossetti, and it is 30 stories and 348 feet tall. So this one is just really not my cup of tea. I also am not a huge fan of gambling and the effects it has just generally on people, but especially on people in Detroit. So I'm going to put it in the F tier. Maybe that's harsh, but I don't think it's architecturally significant, and also the purpose it serves is just not for me. Up next is the Book Cadillac Hotel, which I would say is one of the most iconic buildings in Detroit's entire skyline. It's a pretty massive hotel, and it went through a huge renovation. It was abandoned for a very long time and was in very awful shape, which it's awesome to see it open again, but they did whitewash a lot of it. There isn't a ton of detail left inside of there. It's very pretty. It's very nice. It's just not crazy historic, if that makes sense. So it was designed by Louis Camper, built in 1924, 349 feet tall and 29 stories. So I'm going to put this one in C tier. I really love the building. It's just when they did the renovation, they didn't completely renovate it. They just kind of reopened it, if that makes sense. Still very pretty. Still a great place to stay. It's where a lot of the sports teams play. Just not a great renovation to me. So up next, we've got the Buhl Building, which was designed by Wirt C. Rowland in 1925. It is 366 feet tall and 29 stories. So I think this is one of the more unique buildings in Detroit skyline. It's kind of shaped like a plus and just a very pretty building to look at. It's also still in really, really good shape. I don't have a ton to say about this one. It's one of those buildings that I feel like everyone would look at it and be like, yeah, I know what that building is. I know where it is, but maybe wouldn't know that it's called the Buhl Building. So I'm going to throw this one in a sneaky A tier. Up next is 211 West 4th Street, which really just looks like an office building to me. I can't appreciate that style, but it was designed by Harley Ellington, Cohen, and Shurton. I think I said that right, in 1963. 368 feet tall and 27 stories. So I remember my uncle saying a long time ago that there were architects in Chicago back then that were saying, if it's an office building, it should look like an office building. And that's just one of those to me. But I can appreciate the architectural style. I think it is a very pretty building, and it's in pretty good shape as well. So I'm going to slide this one into the C tier. Again, not really for me, but I can appreciate it, and I'm happy to see that it's still open and still functioning. Up next, we've got the David Broderick Tower, which again is probably one of the most known buildings in Detroit. Most likely because you can see it from Comerica Park. So most of Comerica Park, you're looking right at it, and it has whale murals on the side of it. So most people might not know that it's the David Broderick building, but it has those big whale murals when they're not covered by advertisings for Pepsi and things like that. So this was designed by Louis and Paul Camper in 1928, 369 feet tall and 35 stories. So amazing view from the top. This was abandoned for a very long time. Another building that saw a renovation, and they did a really good job. I don't think that it looks anything like it did back in the day because it had offices in it, and now it is apartments, but just one of the most iconic buildings in Detroit, in my opinion, because of that view from Comerica Park, and just a very cool building and just iconic the way it sits perched on Woodward Avenue. Up next is DTE Energy Headquarters, which was built in 1971 by Emery Roth & Sons, 375 feet and 25 stories. So I hate DTE Energy with a burning passion. They're a terrible company. If you live anywhere in the Metro Detroit area, you probably know this. Even if you don't live in the area and you have consumers, you're like, yeah, consumers isn't great, but I'm glad I don't have DTE. And their Skyscraper is another one of those ones that's like, it's an office building. It looks like an office building. So that combined with the fact that DTE is such a terrible company, this one is going in the F tier, and I don't feel bad about it. So before people hate on me for this, I don't hate brutalist architecture. I think it can be done well. I just don't think this one is done well. But the Patrick V. McNamara Federal Building is just not for me. I think it's very ugly. It's not welcoming at all. I know maybe a federal building shouldn't be welcoming, but it's just an ugly building. I'm not a fan of it. I think brutalism can be done well, but that's not what we have here. So it was designed by Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, which is a very good architectural firm in 1978. 1976, sorry, 393 feet and 27 stories. Really just not for me. I'm not going to put it in F tier, but I'm going to slide it into the E tier. Up next is 1 Woodward Avenue, which is the kind of building that I think I've been mentioning, office buildings should look like office buildings. I think this is the best of the best when it comes to that style. It was designed by, I don't know how to say his first name, so I'm just going to say it's a Yamasaki building, 1963, and that's the same architect who did the World Trade Center, so if this style looks familiar, that might be why you think that. We do have a few Yamasaki buildings around Detroit, but this one is the most prominent to me, and because it's right next to Hart Plaza, you can see it from the river and all of that, but it's 430 feet, 28 stories, so I'm going to put this one in the A tier, because that's probably my favorite of that era of Detroit's architecture, and it's just a really iconic building in my personal opinion. The David Stott Building is a great example of Detroit's Art Deco architecture. We have a ton of it, and this is a great example of what Detroit has to offer when it comes to Art Deco architecture. So 437 feet, 38 stories, John M. Donaldson, built in 1929. So right before the Great Depression swept in and really stopped Detroit's building boom. So I really love this building, and they just renovated it. The apartments are very, very expensive. I could definitely not afford to live there, but I've had the chance to be on the roof before, and it's just a fantastic view. And they did a great job renovating it as well, so it'll be preserved for future generations. So B tier feels pretty safe to me. So Cadillac Tower is another one of those buildings that most people who've been to Detroit will recognize because it has a very prominent place from Campus Martius because there's no other tall buildings near it. And it's a very tall building. It's 438 feet, 40 stories. It was designed by Bona and Chaffee. Not sure exactly how to say that, but it was built in 1927. But it stands alone. It has a big, huge advertising board on it for a long time. There was a Barry Sanders mural on there. And it was also right where the draft was when they had the draft in Detroit. And there was a big ad there. And it's just a very iconic building, kind of the tallest building for quite a while in that general area because everything else has been demolished. So they're talking about building more in that area, which might make it look a little bit less just all by itself. But I'm going to put this one in the B tier because it's a very unique looking building and it's still operational too. So can't scoff at that. I think everyone knows where the Fisher Building is going to go. It's really Detroit's crown jewel in terms of just overall building and preservation. It's still in great shape. They've done a really good job with it over the past 20 years, and it's just an iconic building in New Center. It stands so tall, pretty much all by itself. There are other tall buildings in New Center, but nothing even close to that tall or that ornate just all the way through. So it was designed by Albert Kahn Associates, 1928, 444 feet tall and 30 stories. There are some pretty iconic things in it as well when it comes to radio, and just some people call it the first mall ever because it had like an interior mall area, and just absolutely stunning. If you haven't been inside of the Fisher Building, I highly, highly recommend it. So this one's going to be happily placed in the S tier, and I don't think anyone can really argue with that because it is such a special building. You also have the Fisher Theater inside as well, which is not, it doesn't have its historic charm anymore because it was gutted at one point, but the fact that it's still open and you can do Broadway in Detroit, you can go shopping in there and get a bite to eat. It's really just a great building, and I recommend everybody take a tour of it as well because there are tours. For the longest time, my friends and I called 150 West Jefferson 4 Flags because there are 4 flags on the top of it, and whenever I can't remember the name because it's just the address 150 West Jefferson, I call it 4 Flags. But 455 feet, 26 stories, Heller Manus Architects, 1989. So there wasn't a ton of building going on in that era of Detroit, and this is one of the things that did get built. It's really nothing special to me. I don't have a huge opinion on it, so I'm going to slide it into C tier, but you can easily see it from the river and from Hart Plaza. I used to work on the river, and that was just a building that you could see from everywhere because it is a pretty tall building, and there's nothing really blocking it because there's no buildings on that side of Jefferson. So I feel pretty happy about C tier, but maybe you feel differently. Book Tower is probably one of the most unique buildings in Detroit's skyline, if you ask me, because there's a ton of ornate detail, but they're almost all near the top. So most of the time you have detail kind of throughout, or if there's a lot of detail, you're going to see it on the ground floor because that's where most people are walking by, but that is not how this building was designed. There is detail near the bottom of Book Tower and on the Book Building, but so much of it is near the top, and I highly recommend looking up close-up images of this other than the ones that I'm showing on screen right now. But it was designed by Louis Camper in 1926, 38 stories, 475 feet. Just went through a huge years-long renovation by Dan Gilbert and Bedrock. There's like a rooftop bar there now. It's not all the way at the top of the Book Tower, it's at the top of the Book Building, but you really get a great view of downtown and also of the Book Tower. So I recommend doing that. Even if you're not going to get a drink, just go check out the view. So I'm going to put this one in A tier. I think that is fair. I debated putting it in S tier, but A tier feels a little bit better to me. The Garden Building is another one that if you've been there or if you know anything about it, you know where this building is going to land on this list. So it was built in 1929, designed by Wirt C. Rowland, 40 stories, 495 feet tall. So the interior of this building is absolutely stunning, and it's also open to the public. There's some shopping in there. It's just absolutely magnificent. even when you see these pictures, I recommend going because the inside is just, it takes your breath away. And I've been able to get onto the roof of this one as well a very long time ago. The view from the roof is spectacular, and you can really see those details up top. There are some offices way up there that where I knew someone who had an office, and it's just a spectacular view from up there, and just one of the most unique and detailed buildings that I've ever been in and seen. So you could really spend a long time walking around this one and checking out the inside. And Scrappy agrees that this one should be in S tier. So for RenCen Towers 100 to 400, I think a little bit of personal bias is creeping in. I've just never been a huge fan of the RenCen Center in general, and these small towers are no different. This is just the towers we're talking about right now, not the whole big RenCen Center, which will come later. So the towers are 522 feet, 39 stories, John Portman and Associates in 1977. So I used to work on the Detroit River, and the RenCen Center was just kind of a beacon of me not having a good time working on the Detroit River. I don't think they're very architecturally significant. I understand the history and how iconic they are, but just not for me personally. So I'm going to slide the towers into the D tier. So when I first started planning this video, I was like, Penobscot Building is going to be S tier for sure. It is absolutely iconic, but the more I thought about it and my experience with the Penobscot Building, I kind of changed my mind a little bit. Before we get into that, 565 feet, 47 stories, Wirtz C. Rowland in 1928. So the Penobscot Building is undoubtedly one of the most iconic buildings in Detroit's history. It's absolutely huge, especially for how old it is, but it really hasn't been updated in a very long time. The inside is really just not nice at all. The lobby is really boring, and the current owner, or maybe it's the past owner, I'm not exactly sure, didn't do a great job of maintaining it, and it's just really underutilized. So with that in mind, I can't put it anywhere higher than B tier. I think that if a new owner were to come in and just treat it better, I think it would be A tier or S tier, guaranteed. But with all of that in mind of what's currently going on with the Penobscot Building, it's just not the best. It's not as good as it could be, I should say. So up next is Ally Detroit Center, which is another new addition to Detroit skyline, at least 1993. Pretty new compared to a lot of the other buildings on this list. 619 feet, 43 stories. Philip Johnson and John Burgee, I think is how you say it, in 1993. So I do like the style of this building. It kind of, like some of the other ones I've mentioned, looks a bit like a castle. It's absolutely massive, and there's a ton of local businesses and international and national businesses inside of it as well. The one thing I don't like about it is the lobby is not inviting at all. I just kind of popped in there one day just to see what it was like in there because I wanted to check it out. And I was like escorted out of the building. I wasn't like being weird or anything like that. I just kind of wanted to see what it was like. And they're like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I was just checking it out." And they're like, "You got to leave." And I was like, "Oh, all right, that's not very nice." But with that in mind, I'm going to put it into the D tier. This is a personal list, so don't get mad at me if you really like the Ally Detroit Center. I do think it's unique, but I think that building should be somewhat publicly accessible. That's a personal opinion of mine. Maybe you disagree, but that's why I'm putting it in the D tier. So the absolute newest addition to Detroit skyline is Hudson's Detroit, which topped out, I think it was last year, but it's going to be 685.4 feet tall, 49 stories, and was designed by Shop Architects and Hamilton Anderson Associates. It's supposed to be completed in 2025, which we'll see if that actually gets done, but this is on the site of the former Hudson's department store, and that was demolished in the 1990s, and it just seems like such a shame that that building could not have held out, because it would be really cool to see that still as a part of Detroit skyline, because that was such a important part of Detroit's history. So I can't really judge this building too much because it hasn't opened yet. It's not really my cup of tea when it comes to architectural styles, but that's really just what people are building these days. So I'm going to slide it into the C tier just because I don't really know what it's going to be like. There's going to be a ton of stuff in it, and it's cool to see Detroit building a skyscraper again, but I just don't know enough about what it's going to be like once it opens because it hasn't opened yet. And I'm not a huge fan of the architectural style, so that's why I'm putting it in C tier. But maybe I'll update this list if I end up liking it. So last and maybe least, if you don't like it, is the Renaissance Center. And I already kind of talked about why I don't like the Renaissance Center, but I guess I can elaborate a little bit more on that. So when I worked on the river, a lot of times we would go to the food court in the Renaissance Center, and you would really have to walk a really long way just to get to the food court. And I understand that maybe the food court's just for people who worked in the towers, but you really had to, like, it was like a maze. And I do like the architecture of the interior. I think it's very cool, but it's also just really not set up for people to get around it easily. And it's also like it has its own people mover station, but you can't really access the people mover station very easily, and it's not signed very well. So I think that if they were to renovate the Renaissance Center, they could do some really cool stuff with it. It's just a question of whether they're going to do that and whether they're going to demolish it, because that is still on the table as well. So the Renaissance Center is 727 feet tall, 73 stories, John Portman and Associates, and was completed in 1977. So I'm going to put the Renaissance Center in its current form in the E tier. I really do think that this could come up a lot higher if they were to do a renovation that just changed the layout and made it more friendly to the public. Like, there's lots of stuff for the public in there. It's just not very friendly to get around or sign super well. And there are a ton of signs. It's just a little bit confusing as someone who used to spend a lot of time in there. And maybe if they are to do a selective demolition of maybe 2 of the towers, that could really open it up to the riverfront. I'm still unsure how I feel about all of that. I guess it's going to depend what the actual plans would entail and what would come with that. But either way, I don't like the idea of the city of Detroit being extorted by billionaires and multi-billion-dollar corporations. So I'm putting that one in E tier for now, but who knows, maybe in the future it could slide up to a C or a B, but we'll have to see. So this was my tier list of Detroit skyscrapers. I'm curious to see which ones you agree with, which ones you disagree with, and if there's any other kind of tier list you'd like to make me see on this channel. So if you like this video, please throw a like on it, drop a comment down below, and subscribe to the channel for a new video every Friday. Until next time, this building matters.